The Philippine Sea in October of 1944 was not just a theater of war, it was a pressurized oven. At 05:15 on the morning of October 23rd, Chief Aviation Machinist's mate Silas Vane stood on the edge of the flight deck of the USS Kalinin Bay, watching the horizon bleed a bruised purple. He was 38 years old, which in carrier years made him an ancient relic. His skin was the color of a well-oiled baseball glove, etched with the permanent grime of a man who lived in the guts of radial engines. To the young pilots of Composite Squadron VC-3, Vane was less of a man and more of a mechanical deity, someone who could diagnose a cylinder misfire just by the vibration in the deck plates. But on this morning, Vane wasn't listening to engines. He was looking at the landing gear of an FM-2 Wildcat, and what he saw terrified him more than any Japanese Zero. The Kalinin Bay was a Casablanca-class escort carrier, a jeep carrier in the parlance of the Pacific. These ships were never meant for the front lines of a massive naval engagement. They were small, slow, and unarmored, essentially a merchant hull with a wooden flight deck slapped on top. They were built to hunt submarines and provide air cover for troop landings, not to go toe-to-toe with the Imperial Japanese Navy's heavy cruisers. But as the sun rose over the Philippine Sea, the Kalinin Bay and her sister ships in the task unit known as Taffy 3 found themselves in the path of a storm, and the Wildcats they carried, the planes that were supposed to be their only shield, were suffering from a silent, systemic heart failure. Silas Vane knelt by the portside strut of a Wildcat, his fingers tracing the hydraulic seal. It was supposed to be a tight, resilient ring of synthetic rubber, designed to hold back thousands of pounds of pressure when 7,000 pounds of fighter planes slammed onto a pitching deck at 90 knots. Instead, the seal felt like wet chewing gum. In the brutal 105-degree heat and 90% humidity of the tropics, the official Navy-issue seals were disintegrating. The high-pressure hydraulic fluid, known as cherry juice for its distinct red tint, was weeping out of the struts, staining the wooden deck. Vane knew that if those struts bottomed out during a landing, the impact wouldn't just break the plane. The metal-on-metal friction would create a spark, the leaking fluid would ignite, and the wooden deck of the Kalinin Bay would become a funeral pyre for everyone on board. This was the status quo on the eve of one of the greatest naval battles in history. The Kalinin Bay was a floating target, and its teeth were falling out. Vane had spent the last 3 days documenting the failure, filing reports that disappeared into the bureaucratic void of Pearl Harbor. The official response from the high-ranking engineers back in the rear was cold and clinical. The seals were rated for standard operating conditions. If they were failing, it was a maintenance issue, not a design flaw. They ordered the squadron grounded if more than 10% of the aircraft showed signs of leakage. By Vane's count, 80% of the squadron was already compromised. If you want to understand how a man from the dust-choked plains of Kansas ended up fighting the entire United States Navy bureaucracy to save a ship, you have to understand where Silas Vane came from. He was a product of the Great Depression. He had learned his trade keeping rusted John Deere tractors running in fields where the dirt was so thick you couldn't see your own hands. In Kansas, you didn't wait for a replacement part from a factory in Chicago. You fixed it with baling wire, spit, and whatever was lying in the scrap heap. To Vane, a machine was a living thing that required intuition, not just a manual. The tension on the ship was a physical weight. The pilots knew. They felt the mushy response of the landing gear when they touched down. They saw the deck crews frantically scrubbing the red stains off the wood. Commander Marcus Thorne, the commander of the Air Group, or CAG, was a man who lived by the book. He was a career officer with a polished uniform and a rigid adherence to Navy regulation. To Thorne, Vane was a grease monkey who didn't understand the complexities of aeronautical engineering. The inciting incident occurred at 08:42, just as the morning patrol was returning. Lieutenant Sully Sullivan, a 22-year-old kid with more courage than flight hours, brought his Wildcat in for a standard recovery. The sea was choppy, and the Kalinin Bay's deck was heaving. As Sully's tailhook caught the third wire, the aircraft slammed down. The portside hydraulic seal didn't just leak, it catastrophically failed. The strut collapsed with a sound like a gunshot. The wingtip dug into the mahogany planking, sending a shower of splinters into the air. For a heartbeat, the ship held its breath. The Wildcat skidded toward the edge of the deck, the friction of the collapsed strut screaming against the wood. A plume of white smoke erupted as the hydraulic fluid hit the hot brake drum. Sully fought the controls, his face pale behind the goggles, as the plane ground to a halt just feet from the catwalk. The deck crew rushed in with foam, but the damage was done. The official parts had failed in a way the manuals said was impossible. Vane was the first one to the wreckage. He didn't look at the pilot, he looked at the strut. The seal had sheared into jagged ribbons. It wasn't just the heat, it was the friction of the piston against a seal that had become too brittle in the humidity. The Navy's standard parts were designed for the dry air of California or the cold of the North Atlantic. Here, in the sweltering corridor of the Philippines, they were a death sentence. Commander Thorne arrived on the deck minutes later, his face a mask of fury. He pointed a gloved finger at the collapsed aircraft, and then at Vane. He demanded to know why the aircraft hadn't been grounded. Vane, standing in a pool of red hydraulic fluid, didn't flinch. He told the CAG the truth. If they grounded every plane with a weeping seal, the Kalinin Bay would have no air cover. They would be a sitting duck for the Japanese land-based bombers out of Luzon. Thorne's response was a direct order: ground the squadron. Every FM-2 Wildcat was to be struck below to the hangar deck and stripped for parts. They would wait for the supply ship, the USS Jupiter, which was reportedly carrying a new batch of reinforced seals. But Vane knew the Jupiter was 300 miles away and moving at 12 knots. He also knew, through the grapevine of the ship's radio operators, that a massive Japanese task force, the Center Force, led by the super-battleship Yamato, was moving through the San Bernardino Strait. The Kalinin Bay didn't have weeks. It didn't even have days. It had hours before the horizon would be filled with the largest naval guns ever built. Vane retreated to the hangar deck, a cavernous, oil-scented space that felt like a tomb. His crew, a group of exhausted mechanics who looked more like coal miners than sailors, gathered around him. They were looking for an answer. They were looking for the Kansas tractor logic that had pulled them through every engine failure from Guadalcanal to the Marshall Islands. Vane sat on an empty ammo crate, staring at a discarded parachute that had been damaged during a previous bailout. The silk was high-grade, rubberized to make it airtight. Next to it was a crate of medical supplies destined for the infirmary, including tubs of heavy paraffin wax used for treating burns. In the corner of the hangar, a barrel of thickened grade 120 engine oil sat half-empty. To a naval engineer, these were three unrelated items: a ruined parachute, a medicinal lubricant, and waste oil. To Silas Vane, they were the ingredients of a revolution. He realized that the problem wasn't that the seals weren't strong enough. It was that they weren't flexible enough. The factory rubber was fighting the heat, becoming rigid and then shattering under the sudden 3,000 psi of a landing. He needed something that could breathe, something that would expand with the heat and lubricate the piston simultaneously. He took a pair of shears and cut a strip of the rubberized silk. He dipped it into a mixture of the melted paraffin and the thick oil, creating a tacky, translucent ribbon. He began to wrap it around a spare hydraulic piston, weaving it in a complex, interlocking pattern he had learned from his grandfather, who used to fix leather harness straps for plow horses. This was the sewing project that would eventually become a legend. But at that moment, it was an act of treason. Vane was knowingly violating Navy maintenance protocols during a combat operation. If he was caught, it wouldn't just be a reprimand, it would be a court-martial. He was gambling the lives of the pilots on a strip of silk and some stolen wax. As the sun reached its zenith, the humidity in the hangar deck climbed to 110 degrees. Vane and his men worked in the shadows, hidden behind the hulks of the grounded Wildcats. They weren't just fixing planes, they were reinventing them. They worked in a rhythmic, desperate silence, the only sound the clinking of wrenches and the low murmur of Vane's instructions. He was teaching them how to sew the aircraft back together, but time was the one thing Silas Vane couldn't manufacture. And as the first reports of Japanese scout planes started hitting the radio room, the official world and Vane's improvised reality were about to collide in a spectacular, violent fashion. The Japanese center force was no longer a rumor. It was a looming shadow, and the only thing standing in its way was a small group of jeep carriers whose planes were currently being held together by a Kansas mechanic's desperate intuition. By 13 on October 23rd, the hangar deck of the USS Kalinin Bay had transformed into a vision of industrial purgatory. The temperature had spiked to 112 degrees, and the air was so thick with the smell of vaporized hydraulic fluid and burnt paraffin that men were losing their lunches into the scuppers. Silas Vane stood over a makeshift workbench, 2 ammunition crates and a sheet of plywood, his hands moving with a rhythmic, agonizing precision. He was no longer just a mechanic. He was a surgeon performing a transplant on a dying patient, using nothing but scavenged remains. The fix was proving to be a logistical nightmare. The rubberized silk from the damaged parachutes wasn't uniform. Some strips were thicker than others, and if the weave was off by even a fraction of a millimeter, the hydraulic pressure would find the weak point and blow the seal apart like a wet firecracker. To make matters worse, the medicinal paraffin, stolen under the cover of a simulated medical emergency, had to be kept at a precise melting point. Too hot, and it would lose its viscosity and fail to bond with the silk. Too cool, and it would clump, creating a jagged edge that would score the mirror-polished surface of the landing gear pistons. Every time a piston was scored, the entire assembly became junk. Vane's crew, men who had been awake for 36 hours, were beginning to crack. One of his youngest assistants, a 19-year-old named Miller from Ohio, accidentally tipped a canister of the heated oil wax mixture onto his forearm. The boy didn't scream. He couldn't afford the breath, but the smell of singed skin added another layer of horror to the hangar's atmosphere. Vane didn't look up. He couldn't. He simply told Miller to wrap it in a greasy rag and keep cutting silk. In the brutal calculus of a carrier deck, a mechanic's skin was a fair trade for a pilot's life. The external pressure was mounting with every tick of the ship's chronometer. Above them, on the bridge, the official world was in a state of paralysis. Commander Thorne had received a coded dispatch from the 7th Fleet's logistical hub. The supply ship USS Jupiter, the one carrying the authorized seals, had been diverted. It had been spotted by a Japanese submarine and was performing evasive maneuvers 50 miles further east than expected. The official solution was now a ghost, a promise that wouldn't be kept until the battle was already over. Thorne descended to the hangar deck at 14:15. He didn't look like a commander. He looked like a man who was watching his career evaporate. He stood 10 feet away from Vane's workbench, watching the chief weave a strip of wax-soaked silk around a piston. To Thorne, it looked like witchcraft. It looked like the desperate flailings of a man who didn't respect the laws of physics. He saw the cherry juice dripping into buckets, the frayed silk, and the thick, black engine oil. "Chief!" Thorne's voice was a low growl, barely audible over the hum of the ventilation fans. "The Bureau of Aeronautics spent 4 years and $6 million designing those landing struts. You're telling me you can replace their engineering with a sewing kit and some candle wax?" Vane stopped. He didn't look at the CAG. He looked at his own hands, calloused, stained black to the knuckles, the fingernails cracked and bleeding. "Commander," Vane said, his voice like gravel grinding together, "the Bureau of Aeronautics designed those struts for a laboratory in Maryland. They didn't design them for a ship that's sweating through its own hull in the Philippine Sea. Their engineering is failing because it's too perfect. It doesn't know how to give. This silk, it knows how to give. It'll hold because it's as messy as the world we're fighting in." Thorne didn't respond. He couldn't. He was trapped between a regulation that would ground his planes and a mechanic who was offering him a suicidal alternative. He turned and left, but the threat of a court-martial hung in the air like the humidity. Vane knew that if even one of these homemade seals failed, if a single wildcat cartwheeled across the deck because of his silk weave, he wouldn't just lose his rank. He would be responsible for the destruction of the ship and the deaths of hundreds of men. Inside Vane's mind, the silence of the Great Depression returned. He remembered his father, a man who had watched his crops wither into dust 3 years in a row. He remembered the old man standing over a broken thresher, refusing to give up, using a leather belt and a handful of river clay to seal a leaking steam pipe. His father had taught him that the manual is just a suggestion when the world is breaking down. You don't ask what a machine is supposed to do. You ask what it can do. But the emotional weight was suffocating. Every time Vane finished a seal and handed the piston back to a mechanic to be reinstalled in an FM2, he felt like he was handing a loaded gun to a child. He thought of Sully, the kid who had almost died that morning. Sully had a wife in San Diego and a baby he'd never seen. If Vane's sewing project wasn't perfect, if the friction generated enough heat to ignite the paraffin, the landing gear wouldn't just collapse. It would explode like a magnesium flare right under the fuel tanks. At 15:30, the situation shifted from a technical crisis to an existential one. The ship's intercom crackled to life with a sound that sent a cold shiver through the sweltering hangar. It wasn't the standard, "Now hear this." It was the frantic, high-pitched tone of a radar operator who had seen the impossible. "General quarters, all hands man your battle stations. This is not a drill." The reports flooded in. A massive Japanese task force, Admiral Kurita's center force, had emerged from the San Bernardino Strait. This wasn't a small scouting party. It was the backbone of the Imperial Japanese Navy. 4 battleships, including the Yamato, the largest warship ever built, whose 18-inch guns could hurl a shell the weight of a car over 20 miles. Alongside them were 8 cruisers and 11 destroyers. The Kalinin Bay and the other 5 escort carriers of Taffy III were all that stood between this Leviathan and the vulnerable troop transports landing in Leyte Gulf. The escort carriers were tin cans. Their hull plating was less than half an inch thick, so thin that Japanese armor-piercing shells would likely pass through one side and out the other without even exploding. They had no heavy guns. Their only defense, their only hope of survival, was the squadron of wildcats sitting in the hangar with their guts spilled out on the deck. Commander Thorne's voice came over the internal comms, but this time it wasn't a threat. It was a plea. "Chief Vane, I need those planes. I don't care if you use silk, wax, or chewing gum. If those wildcats aren't on the flight deck in 2 hours, we're all dead men. Do you copy?" Vane didn't answer through the comms. He just looked at his crew. "You heard the man," he said. "The official parts aren't coming. We're the only ones left. If you've got a mother, a wife, or a girl back home, you put her in every weave of that silk. We aren't just fixing airplanes anymore. We're building the only thing that's going to keep this ship from being sent to the bottom." The next 2 hours were a blur of frenzied, greasy motion. The hangar deck, once a place of methodical repair, became a factory of desperation. Vane moved from plane to plane, his fingers flying, his eyes bloodshot from the fumes. He was checking the torque on the strut bolts, verifying the seal seating, and watching as the cherry juice was pumped back into the systems. The mechanics were working with a terrifying speed. They were no longer following the 144-step recovery process outlined in the Navy Tech Manual. They were skipping steps, bypassing safety checks, and focusing on one thing: getting the struts to hold pressure. As the first Wildcat was pushed onto the elevator, Vane stood back for a second, his chest heaving. The plane looked the same as it always had. The blue-gray paint was chipped, the cowlings were stained with exhaust, and the VC-3 stenciled on the tail was fading. But inside the dark recesses of the landing gear, hidden from the eyes of the world, was a secret made of parachute silk and medicinal wax. The elevator groaned as it rose toward the flight deck. Vane followed it up, stepping out into the blinding glare of the afternoon sun. The wind was whipping across the deck, carrying the salt spray of the Philippine Sea. In the distance, the first puffs of black smoke from the Japanese fleet were visible on the horizon. The giants were coming, and the jeep carrier was about to fight for its life. Vane watched as Lieutenant Sully climbed into the cockpit of the first Wildcat. The kid looked at Vane and gave a thumbs up. He didn't know that his life was literally resting on a piece of cloth that Vane had sewn together 3 hours ago. Vane didn't return the gesture. He just watched the landing gear. He watched for the telltale red leak. There was none. The homemade seals were holding. For now. But the real test wasn't the takeoff. The real test would be the return. If the Wildcats survived the Japanese Zeros and the blistering anti-aircraft fire of the Yamato, they would have to come back. They would have to slam their 7,000-pound frames onto this wooden deck, putting all that pressure on Vane's improvised silk. As the first engine roared to life, a violent, coughing snarl that tore through the air, Silas Vane realized that he had either saved the Kalinin Bay or he had built a fleet of flying coffins. And as the Wildcat began its roll down the short wooden deck, the entire future of the Pacific campaign seemed to hang on the strength of a Kansas mechanics sewing project. The morning air of October 25th was shattered by the arrival of Technicolor Death. At 06:58, the first Japanese shells landed around the Taffy III task unit. Silas Vane, standing on the catwalk just below the flight deck, felt the ship shudder as if it had struck an underwater mountain. The Japanese used colored dye in their shells, pink, yellow, brilliant green, to track the splashes of their ranging shots. Around the Kalinin Bay, the Pacific Ocean was blooming with a surreal, murderous garden of neon water. The jeep carrier was now in a fight that defied every rule of naval engagement. On paper, it shouldn't have lasted 5 minutes. The Yamato's shells weighed 3,200 pounds each. They were larger than the jeep's small cars. If one of those shells hit the Kalinin Bay directly, the ship wouldn't just sink, it would cease to exist. Commander Thorne's voice screamed over the bullhorns, ordering every available aircraft into the air. Vane watched as the first of his sewn-together Wildcats taxied toward the catapult. The pilots weren't just taking off, they were being flung into a meat grinder. Because the carriers were so slow and the wind was light, the Wildcats had to use every inch of the short wooden deck. The landing gear took the brunt of the pre-launch vibrations, the struts compressed and rebounding as the pilots held the brakes and throttled up to full combat power. Vane saw the pistons of Sully's plane pulsing against the improvised silk seals. He held his breath, waiting for the cherry juice to spray, waiting for the silk to shred. It didn't. The Wildcat roared off the deck, dipping dangerously low toward the Whitecaps before finding its lift and clawing into the sky. One by one, the squadron launched. They were flying into a wall of anti-aircraft fire so thick it looked like a solid ceiling of gray clouds. By Euro 8:30, the situation on the Kalinin Bay had moved from desperate to apocalyptic. The ship had taken its first direct hit. An 8-inch shell from a Japanese heavy cruiser had punched through the thin hull plating near the stern, exploding in the crew's quarters. The vibration had knocked Vane off his feet, sending his toolkit sliding across the grease-slicked deck. In the hangar, the smoke was becoming a living thing, a black, oily curtain that choked the lungs. Vane climbed back to the flight deck, his eyes searching the sky. He could see the Wildcats diving on the Japanese cruisers. They were out of bombs. They were out of torpedoes. They were performing dry runs, diving at the enemy bridges just to force the Japanese gunners to take cover, essentially using their planes as psychological weapons. It was a suicidal bluff, and the pilots were doing it in planes that Vane had rebuilt with a sewing kit. Inside the cockpit of Blue 3, Lieutenant Sully was a man possessed. His instrument panel was vibrating so violently he could barely read the manifold pressure. He had just finished a strafing run on the cruiser Haguro, his 650 caliber machine gun screaming until they ran dry. Now, he was nursing a plane that had taken several hits to the tail section. He looked at his fuel gauge. The needle was bouncing on the red line. He had to land. But the Kalinin Bay was currently under fire from two different directions, zigzagging at a frantic 17 knots, its deck pitching in the wake of nearby explosions. Sully keyed his mic. "Kalinin Base, this is Blue 3. I'm bingo fuel and my tail's ragged. Requesting emergency recovery." On the deck, Silas Vane heard the request over the radio patch. He looked at the wooden planks. They were scorched and splintered. The official Navy engineers would have told Sully to ditch in the sea. The manual stated that a damaged aircraft with questionable landing gear should never attempt a carrier recovery under fire. The risk of a deck fire was too great. But Vane knew that if Sully ditched in those shark-infested, shell-churned waters, he was a dead man. The Japanese destroyers were moving in to pick off survivors. Vane grabbed a signal flag and ran toward the landing signal officer, LSO. "He's coming in!" Vane shouted over the roar of the wind and the whump of the ship's 5-inch stern gun. The LSO, a man named Miller who was usually as cool as ice, looked at Vane with wide, terrified eyes. "Chief, the CAG said those struts won't hold. If he cartwheels, he'll take out the whole deck crew." "They'll hold," Vane roared back, his voice cracking. "I didn't use their rubber. I used the silk. Let him land." It was a moment of pure, unadulterated tension. Vane was staring at the LSO, a mechanic challenging an officer's fear with nothing but his own intuition. Behind them, Commander Thorne was on the bridge, his binoculars fixed on Sully's approaching Wildcat. Thorne had the power to wave the pilot off, to effectively sign his death warrant to save the ship. He looked at the red stains on the deck from the morning's failures. Then he looked down and saw Vane, standing there like a statue of grease and defiance. Thorne didn't give the wave off. Sully's Wildcat turned onto the final approach. The plane was crabbed into the wind, its engine coughing as it sucked the last vapors of fuel from the tanks. As the aircraft crossed the fantail, it looked like a broken bird. The tailhook was down, swinging like a pendulum. The landing gear, the focus of Vane's obsession, was extended, the struts gleaming in the harsh Pacific sun. The impact was violent. Sully didn't just land, he fell out of the sky. The Wildcat slammed onto the deck with a force that would have shattered the official brittle seals instantly. The struts compressed to their maximum limit, the metal pistons disappearing into the housings. Vane's heart stopped. He waited for the explosion. He waited for the red spray of hydraulic fire. Instead, something miraculous happened. The silk and wax seals, rather than resisting the sudden surge of 3,000 psi, acted like a variable rate spring. The paraffin, softened by the ambient heat and the friction of the stroke, allowed the silk to compress and then expand with a fluid, organic grace. The shock wasn't just absorbed, it was dampened. The Wildcat didn't bounce, it didn't veer. It stayed glued to the deck as the tailhook snagged the third wire. The plane jerked to a halt, the engine giving one final sputtering gasp before dying. Sully sat in the cockpit for a second, his head slumped against the headrest. Vane was the first one to reach the plane. He didn't check on the pilot. The medics were already there. He dove under the wing, his hands searching the strut. It was hot enough to blister his skin, but it was bone dry. The improvised seal had held. Not a drop of cherry juice had escaped. The silk had done what the multi-million-dollar engineering of the Bureau of Aeronautics could not. But there was no time for celebration. As Sully was pulled from the cockpit, 3 more Wildcats appeared on the horizon, all of them smoking, all of them low on fuel. And beyond them, the massive silhouette of a Japanese cruiser was closing the range. The Japanese were confused. Their gunnery officers, looking through high-powered optics, couldn't understand why the American carriers were still launching and recovering aircraft. By their calculations, the escort carriers should have been paralyzed by mechanical failures and fires by now. The Japanese admiral, Kurita, was beginning to lose his nerve. He believed he was fighting a much larger force, a belief fueled by the sheer ferocity and relentless activity of the Taffy 3 aircraft. He didn't know he was fighting a group of mechanics and pilots who were essentially cheating the laws of physics. As the second and third Wildcats came in for landings, the deck of the Kalinin Bay became a choreographed scene of industrial madness. Vane's crew would catch a plane, check the struts, refuel it from hand-pumped canisters because the main lines were severed, and shove it back toward the catapult. The turning point came at 09:15. A massive shell from the cruiser, Haguro, struck the flight deck of the Kalinin Bay near the forward elevator. The explosion tore a 10-foot hole in the wood and twisted the steel support beams. The ship began to list to port. "We can't recover anymore," the LSO screamed. "The deck's compromised." Vane looked at the hole, then at the sky. There were still 6 Wildcats up there. If they couldn't land, they were gone. He looked at his men. They were covered in soot, their uniforms shredded. "Get the plywood," Vane ordered. "And the paraffin." In the middle of a naval battle, under direct fire from a Japanese cruiser, Silas Vane led a team of mechanics onto the flight deck to patch a shell hole. They used the same logic he had used on the landing gear. They didn't try to make it perfect, they just made it work. They bolted heavy sheets of plywood over the hole and poured the remaining melted wax into the gaps to create a smooth, if temporary, surface. It was insane. It was a violation of every safety protocol in the history of aviation. But as the next Wildcat came in, its wheels rolling right over Vane's waxy patch, the landing gear held. The silk seals, now battle-hardened, took the uneven impact of the patched deck without flinching. Commander Thorne, watching from the bridge, finally understood. He saw Vane standing near the edge of the hole, a wrench in one hand and a strip of parachute silk in the other. He realized that the war wasn't being won by the men who wrote the manuals. It was being won by the men who knew how to tear them up when the world started burning. But the battle was far from over. The Japanese giants were still closing in, and the Kalinin Bay was running out of luck, out of wax, and out of time. The final test of Vane's homemade fleet was about to begin, and it would require a sacrifice that no manual could ever prepare them for. At 09:24 on the morning of October 25th, the USS Kalinin Bay was no longer a ship in the traditional sense. It was a floating, screaming testament to the endurance of scrap metal and human will. The Japanese heavy cruiser Haguro had found the range, and 8-inch shells were walking their way across the water toward the carrier's thin skin. The ship had already absorbed 15 direct hits from various Japanese vessels. The hangar deck was a labyrinth of smoke, the forward elevator was jammed, and the list to port had increased to 7 degrees. On a standard carrier, this would be the signal to abandon ship, but for Taffy 3, there was nowhere to go. Silas Vane stood on the listing flight deck, his boots slipping in a cocktail of seawater, foam, and the ever-present cherry juice. He was watching the last of VC-3's Wildcats circle for a landing. Among them was White 12, piloted by Lieutenant Junior Grade Tommy Tex Miller. Tex's plane had been chewed up by 20mm cannon fire from a Mitsubishi Zero. His left landing gear was visibly sagging, the strut partially severed by a shrapnel hit. In any other circumstance, the pilot would be ordered to bail out, but Tex was wounded, blood streaking his canopy, and he didn't have the strength to climb out of the cockpit in midair. He had to bring it down. The official Navy manual was clear. A damaged hydraulic strut with a compromised seal cannot maintain the internal pressure required to lock the gear for a landing. The impact would cause the strut to telescope violently, the wing would fold, and the plane would explode. But Tex's Wildcat didn't have an official seal. It had Vane's sewing project. As White 12 turned into the groove, the ship took another hit near the waterline. The Kalinin Bay groaned, a deep metallic shudder that felt like the ship's spine was snapping. Vane gripped a tie-down cleat, his eyes locked on that sagging strut. He could see the silk, the wax-impregnated, hand-woven ribbon of parachute fabric, bulging out of the gap where the metal housing had been shredded. It looked like a bandage on a mortal wound. "Come on, Tex," Vane whispered, his voice lost in the thunder of the ship's 5-inch gun. "Hold together, you beautiful, ragged piece of junk." The Wildcat hit the deck hard, too hard. It was a controlled crash at nearly 100 miles per hour. The damaged port strut took the full weight of the impact. Vane saw the piston slam into the housing, the silk seal compressing until it was nothing more than a dense, oily knot of fabric. For a microsecond, the laws of aeronautical engineering predicted total failure. But the silk didn't shatter like the factory rubber. It flowed. The paraffin, heated by the sheer kinetic energy of the impact, acted as a high-pressure lubricant, allowing the jagged metal edges of the damaged strut to slide over the silk rather than cutting through it. The gear held. The plane lurched, caught the wire, and slammed into the deck, staying upright. Not a single spark ignited. Not a single drop of hydraulic fluid sprayed the deck. At 09:30, just as the last plane was recovered, the unthinkable happened. The massive Japanese center force, the Leviathan that had been minutes away from annihilating the entire task unit, turned around. Admiral Kurita, convinced by the relentless, suicidal attacks of the Taffy 3 aircraft that he was facing the entire American Third Fleet, ordered a retreat. The giants were running away from the tin cans. The silence that followed was more deafening than the gunfire. On the deck of the Kalinin Bay, men simply sat down where they stood. They were covered in soot, blood, and the gray ash of the wooden deck. Silas Vane walked over to Tex's plane. He didn't wait for the medics. He climbed onto the wing and looked into the cockpit. Tex was conscious, his face pale, but he was alive. He looked at Vane, then at the landing gear that had saved his life. "Chief," Tex rasped, "whatever you put in those struts, don't ever tell the Navy what it was. They'll just try to make it out of steel and ruin it." In the weeks that followed, the USS Kalinin Bay limped back to San Pedro for repairs. The ship was a sieve, riddled with holes, yet it had survived a battle it was never meant to fight. When the official engineering inspectors from Pearl Harbor arrived to survey the damage, they found something they couldn't explain. They looked at the landing gear of the surviving FM-2 Wildcats and saw the remains of Vane's improvised seals. The lead engineer, a captain with a degree from MIT and a chest full of ribbons, pulled a strip of the oil-soaked silk out of a piston housing. He smelled the paraffin. He felt the weave. He looked at Vane, who was standing at attention, prepared for the court-martial that Commander Thorne had threatened. "Chief," the captain asked, "is this parachute silk?" "Yes, sir," Vane replied, his voice steady. "And you used medicinal paraffin as a bonding agent?" "Yes, sir, along with thickened grade 120 oil." The engineer looked at the data logs. Every single Wildcat in VC-3 had performed an average of 4 combat sorties that day. Every single one had landed on a pitching, damaged deck. Not a single hydraulic failure had been recorded. According to the official specs, at least 60% of the fleet should have suffered strut collapses due to the tropical heat and the intensity of the landings. The official report that was eventually filed in the Navy archives is a masterpiece of bureaucratic obfuscation. It acknowledged that field-expedient maintenance procedures had been utilized on the USS Kalinin Bay to mitigate the effects of tropical humidity on synthetic rubber components. It never mentioned the word parachute. It never mentioned wax, and it certainly never mentioned Silas Vane by name. To the Navy, acknowledging that a Kansas mechanics sewing project was superior to their multi-million-dollar engineering program was an institutional impossibility. They didn't court-martial Vane. The captain of the Kalinin Bay saw to that. But they didn't give him a medal either. Instead, he was quietly transferred to a training facility in the Midwest, far away from the front lines, where his unconventional methods wouldn't ruffle any more feathers in the Bureau of Aeronautics. But the story didn't end in a filing cabinet. Word of the Vane seal spread through the Jeep carrier fleet like a secret gospel. Mechanics on the Fanshawe Bay, the White Plains, and the Gambier Bay began accidentally damaging parachutes and losing tubs of paraffin. For the remainder of the war, whenever the official supply lines failed or the tropical heat turned the Navy's rubber into mush, the Kansas fix was there. It was a silent revolution, a ghost in the machine that kept hundreds of pilots alive and dozens of ships from burning. Silas Vane returned to Kansas after the war. He didn't talk much about the Philippine Sea. He went back to fixing tractors, using the same intuition and grit that had saved the Kalinin Bay. He died in 1974, a quiet man who left behind a toolbox and a few old photographs of a ship that looked more like a colander than a carrier. Today, if you visit the naval museums or look at the restored FM-2 Wildcats in air shows, you'll see perfectly maintained hydraulic systems with modern, high-tech seals that can withstand any temperature. The official history says that the landing gear issues of 1944 were solved by a redesign of the synthetic rubber compounds in early 1945. But if you talk to the few remaining veterans of Taffy 3, they'll tell you a different story. They'll tell you about the red cherry juice on the deck and the man who fixed the world with a sewing kit. The lesson of Silas Vane is a universal one, often forgotten in an age of computer-aided design and automated manufacturing. It's the realization that innovation doesn't always come from a laboratory or a boardroom. Sometimes the most sophisticated solution to a complex problem is the one born of desperation, intuition, and a total disregard for the official way of doing things. In the heat of battle, a mechanic's hands are often more reliable than an engineer's slide rule. If this story of the man who sewed an Air Force back together moved you, please hit that like button. Every single like tells the algorithm that these stories of forgotten ingenuity deserve to be heard. It helps us keep the memory of men like Silas Vane alive, men who didn't wait for permission to save their brothers. Drop a comment below and let us know where you're watching from. Have you ever had to use a homemade fix to get out of a tight spot? We love hearing your stories of ingenuity. You aren't just a viewer, you're part of a community that values the grit and wisdom of those who came before us. Silas Vane never got his name in the history books, and he never asked for it. He was just a man from Kansas who knew that when the world is falling apart, you don't look for a manual, you look for a way to make it hold. And on one bloody morning in 1944, a bit of silk and wax held the entire Pacific together. Thank you for watching, and stay tuned for our next deep dive into the hidden history of the men who built the world through the fire of war.